Our witnesses today are Avril Haines, the Director of National Intelligence, Jen Easterly, Director of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, and Lisa Knapp, Executive Assistant Director of the National Security Branch at the FBI. Welcome to all of you. Today's hearing builds on this committee's bipartisan efforts since 2016 to educate the public on the intentions of foreign adversaries seeking to undermine the integrity of our democratic systems, and to ensure that U.S. government is postured to protect our elections from those foreign threats. A broad interagency task force is tasked with protecting from two forms of election interference we've seen since 2016. Interference efforts, often cyber-enabled, that target election infrastructure, and separately, influence efforts that seek to affect elections through covert or other illegal tactics. Since 2016, we have held both open and closed hearings ahead of each federal election, featuring testimony from U.S. officials, social media executives, and open source research executives. This is the first open hearing of this campaign season, but more will be coming. Now, I want to start by recalling the fact that I fear at times, since particularly the 2016 cycle was so long ago, that the public perception of past foreign election meddling has too often been treated as something that was trivial or not of major league. But as this committee's exhaustive bipartisan investigation into Russia's meddling in 2016 election showed, and as declassified intelligence community assessment showed, foreign influence efforts go well beyond simple online trolling or traditional propaganda. Foreign election efforts in the last 8 years have, among other things, involved efforts to infiltrate both online and in person a range of U.S. organizations on both sides of the political spectrum with the goal of stoking political polarization in the United States and promoting social and racial strife. We've seen as well successful impersonations of U.S. political and social organizations, with the Russian IRA, memorably back in 2016, having Twitter and Facebook accounts for the Tennessee GOP and Black Lives Matter. Both of those accounts were actually bigger than the real organizations. We've seen harassment and sting operations against U.S. candidates, particularly as when we saw just last cycle, the PRC influence operatives try to set up a sting operation to bully and humiliate a congressional candidate of Chinese heritage. We've seen successful efforts to actually organize real-world political rallies. Back in 2016 again, with one almost coming to real-life violence. Russian efforts orchestrated simultaneous rallies in Houston, one with an anti-Muslim event taking place at exactly the same time and place as a Muslim cultural event. Luckily, law enforcement intervened. We have also seen personalized emails sent in 2020 by Iranian influence actors posing as Proud Boys, which the Trump administration leadership did a good job of pointing out. Globally, we've seen many of the same foreign influence actors aggressively meddling in the elections of our democratic allies. The PRC's influence actors aggressively sought to shape the outcome of Taiwan's election earlier this year, including promoting narratives that the election had been rigged as election day neared. More recently, literally in the last few weeks, Czech and Belgian officials have disclosed efforts of Russian operatives to shape the outcome of June's EU elections with the goal of undermining European support for Ukraine. And a wide range of media open source research and other sources has similarly pointed to Russian influence operations in Slovakia, one of the cases that I think is particularly interesting, a country that when Russia invaded, 75% plus of the Slovaks supported Ukraine. A few years later, due to Russian efforts, Slovakia now has a pro-Russian president, and literally 55% of the Slovaks have been told saying they think the United States started the war in Ukraine. We've seen recently as well, deepfakes of the Moldavian president have been widely circulated. And fresh off the presses, just a couple hours, I'm not going to ask our witnesses to testify, but a new Russian effort geared at somehow saying that Zelensky and the CIA are working on trying to undermine again our elections in this year. The barriers to entry for foreign malign influence have unfortunately become incredibly small. Since 2016, we've seen declassified intelligence assessments name a whole host of influence actors who've engaged in, or at least contemplated, election influence and interference activities. Not only Russia, not only Iran or PRC, but also Cuba, Venezuela, terrorist organizations like Hezbollah, and a range of foreign hacktivists and profit-motivated cybercriminals. One of the things, and why I think this hearing is so important, in many ways, our adversaries could be more sophisticated and aggressive in both scale and scope in this election even than in prior years. Let me tell you why I think that's the case. First, our adversaries are more incentivized than ever to intervene in our elections because they can understand that it could affect their particular national interest. In the case of Russia, Putin clearly understands that influencing public opinion and shaping elections in the United States is a cheap way to erode American and Western support for Ukraine. Similarly, we've seen the conflict between Israel and Hamas has been fertile ground for disinformation since October 7th. Second, the scale and sophistication of these sorts of attacks against our elections can now be accelerated by AI tools. The truth is, the kind of audio and video manipulation that even as recently as 4 years ago and clearly 8 years ago was still a challenge, now can happen at a speed and scale due to AI tools that's unprecedented. And literally, there's not a week or month that goes by that those AI video and audio tools don't continue to improve. And I just, on a personal note, I fear that Congress's inability to pass any new guardrails in the last 18 months for AI-enabled mischief really could pose a huge problem. We've already seen fake video of President Trump embracing Dr. Fauci. We've seen audios of President Biden telling people to use a different voting day in New Hampshire. The truth is, these tools are out there and growing in their danger. Third, we've seen, unfortunately, increasingly large numbers of Americans of all political stripes across the political spectrum who simply don't trust U.S. institutions, from federal agencies and law enforcement to mainstream media, who increasingly rely on the wildest conspiracy theories imaginable that pop up on the web. And fourth, since 2022, we've seen a concerted litigation campaign that has sought to undermine the federal government's ability to share on any kind of voluntary basis vital threat information with social media platforms. And unfortunately, since 2022, we've seen from some of those same social media platforms considerable disinvestment and, in certain cases, utter disinterest in platform integrity by some of those social media companies. And an area where the Vice Chairman and I have worked very closely together, we've seen the rise of a dominant social media platform, TikTok, with ownership based in a country that is clearly adversarial in terms of their intents on our elections. It is these kinds of attempts by foreign actors and adversaries to sow disinformation, undermine confidence in elections, and seed discord that Americans can expect their federal agencies, both law enforcement and intelligence, to help detect and defeat. We've got to do a better job of making sure Americans of all political stripes understand what is very probably coming their way over the next less than 6 months. I hope today's witnesses can provide a comprehensive overview of these and current threats and anything that may be emerging, and what we can do in a collaborative, cooperative, bipartisan way to make sure that the public is aware of this, I think, dramatic threat to our democracy. With that, I'll turn it to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you. Thanks for calling this hearing, and thank you all for being here on this important topic. And by the way, it's one I think we're going to be dealing with for the next quarter century, but it's hopefully one we get to learn from experience on. I always think it's important at the outset to sort of, because I know this will be discussed as and election threats to the election is a broad topic, and it's always bifurcated into two things. There's election interference, which is trying to hack into the voter database or messing with the early reporting, unofficial reporting system of a state, things of that nature. That's more easily understood. And then there is this whole topic of influence. And it's not just in elections, it's also in our debates. I mean, we saw elements of that during COVID. We see it during policy debates here on a range of topics. The propaganda has always been a weapon of war. I think today you can do it at scale, faster, more convincing, and in ways that spread very quickly and are difficult to contain. And in particular, we've seen this globally. I mean, we've seen increasing amount of damage that's being done to the reputation of the United States in parts of Africa by a very active effort to undermine, make life very difficult for our diplomats who serve in that region, our military personnel in some of these countries where, you know, the Russians have moved in and gained greater influence. So all of that is happening at a global scale, and the chairman's already talked about some of the countries that have faced efforts to meddle in their elections and try to influence and steer the outcome, and in some cases successfully. But today, I think the focus is going to be on how this could be used in an election and in policy debates too, but let's focus on elections for a moment. And the reason why I want to really focus on that is I think we'll hear a lot about the tools that are available, the capabilities that someone has to put out an AI video, to spread narratives that are difficult to knock down and so forth, the weaponization of this information. What I hope to learn a little bit more about is when this happens, if this happens, who's in charge of responding to it? Have we thought through the process of what do we do when one of these scenarios occurs? Because I don't think I have a clear understanding of who's in charge and how we would respond, who would take the lead. I know that if a hurricane is headed towards the United States, the National Hurricane Center is going to put meteorologists on the air who are going to describe to us, this is the hurricane, this is what it looks like, this is how strong it's going to be when it gets here. They're going to put out forecasts. It's going to issue warnings, and people, Republicans, Democrats, no matter who you're going to vote for, are going to take the appropriate steps. If something like that were headed towards our election, I don't know who's in charge of putting it out there. More importantly, I think no matter who puts it out there, the candidate or issue on the other side of it, their followers are going to question whether it's the government interfering in the elections themselves. And it's not helpful as an example, and I use this as an example because it's a very recent one. When the whole laptop situation happened, the Hunter Biden laptop, a number of former intelligence officials, I get it, they're formers, no longer in the employ of any of these agencies, but that title carries weight, all signed a letter saying this has all the hallmarks of a Russian disinformation campaign. We know now that it was not a disinformation campaign. I don't want to get into the particulars of what was on it. I'm just saying we now know that it was not a Russian disinformation campaign. But the result of it was that social media companies would not allow anyone to post the articles, and there was a media blackout. It could not be reported in any other except for one place. And so what happens as a result of that, whether it had an influence on the election or not, the result of it now is that we have some segment of the country who repeatedly says things like the intelligence community interfered, even these reformers, but that title. And so why that is relevant here is because no matter who this disinformation campaign is geared after, the other side is going to say the people issuing the warnings are people that are interfering in the elections on behalf of the candidate they favor. So we're in a real quandary here. But I do think we have to begin by at least understanding if something were to happen. If tomorrow there was a video, very convincing video of a candidate, for, let's not say president, let's say U.S. Senate or Congress, and a video comes out with 72 hours to go before Election Day of that candidate saying some racist comment or doing something horrifying, but it's fake. Who is in charge of letting people know this thing is fake? This thing is not real, so that we can have people going to go to the ballot box believing something that's not real is real. That's influencing our election, especially a close one. And I ask myself, whoever's in charge of it, what are we doing to protect the credibility of the entity that is, whoever it is in charge of saying it, so that the other side does not come out and say our own government is interfering in the election. So I think we're going to be struggling with this for a very long time because the Russians are the best at it. They've been doing it a long time, and so they know, and they've perfected it. But every election cycle, more and more cast of characters are joining the parade here in terms of getting into this business. And I think in the years to come, we're going to see more and more nation states and maybe non-state actors begin to not just come after us in our elections and our political process, but those of other countries as well. So this issue is not going away anytime soon. I think it's only going to accelerate. It's going to get worse. And we really need to begin to lay out some parameters about how we're going to respond to these things in a coordinated way that we know ahead of time, as opposed to the ad hoc basis in which this has been handled in years past in terms of responding to the disinformation piece of it. It's a tough one to handle, but it's one that I think we have to get a handle on.
I agree. I'm not sure. I think, Director Haines, you're going to lead us off.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, Chairman Warner, Ranking Member Rubio, and members of the committee. I really appreciate having the opportunity to brief you on the intelligence community election security work alongside my colleagues at CISA and FBI, who are leading efforts to take actions to secure our elections alongside the extraordinary state and local officials who are on the front lines of this work. The U.S. government's efforts to protect our elections have improved significantly since the 2016 presidential election, and even as the threat landscape is becoming increasingly complicated, it is my view that the U.S. government has never been better prepared to address the challenge. Protecting our democratic processes from foreign influence or interference is an absolute priority for the intelligence community. Our efforts are effectively organized by the Foreign Malign Influence Center, or FMIC, which houses the Election Threats Executive. And the Election Threats Executive leads, coordinates, and integrates the IC's activities, initiatives, and programs in this realm. And fundamentally, we support the federal government, particularly CISA and the FBI, as they work to secure our elections, as well as state and local election officials across the country who actually manage and secure the election infrastructure on a day-to-day basis. We do so by ensuring that our resources are aligned to promote collection and analysis so that we're able to identify and mitigate foreign threats to our elections and communicate our assessments to our federal partners, to you in Congress, to state and local officials, and to the American people. We also facilitate a notification framework that ensures that when relevant intelligence is collected concerning a foreign influence operation aimed at our election, appropriate notice is given to those who are being targeted so that they can take action. And while most of these notifications are non-public, there are, as you both indicated, scenarios in which public notifications are appropriate, and if doing so would render the foreign influence operation less effective, and that is part of that mandate. Of course, exposing a foreign actor's efforts is only one way in which we counter election threats. We support the law enforcement community as they disrupt election influence operations through legal action, including the disruption of illicit financial networks. And we also support Cybercom as it conducts a range of cyber operations to ensure that foreign adversaries cannot use our digital infrastructure to attack our elections. And using every tool we have is critical as the challenge is expanding. Over the last several years, we've seen really three trends that make the threat landscape more diverse and more complex. First, there are an increasing number of foreign actors, including non-state entities, who are looking to engage in election influence activities. Second, there are more commercial firms through which state actors are able to conduct election influence activities, often increasing the sophistication of such activities while making it more challenging to track down the original instigator of the foreign influence efforts. And then third, perhaps most obviously, relevant emerging technologies, particularly generative AI and big data analytics, are increasing the threat by enabling the proliferation of influence actors who can conduct targeted campaigns, reducing the number of relatively sophisticated influence operations and content, and further complicating attribution. For example, innovations in AI have enabled foreign influence actors to produce seemingly authentic and tailored messaging more efficiently at greater scale and with content adapted for different languages and cultures. In fact, we've already seen generative AI being used in the context of foreign elections. In September 2023, 2 days before the parliamentary elections in Slovakia, which, Chairman, you noted, a fake audio recording was released online in which one candidate discussed how to rig the upcoming election with a journalist. The audio was quickly shown to be fake, with signs of AI manipulation, but under Slovakia law, there is a moratorium on campaigning and media commentary about the election for 48 hours before polls open. And since the deepfake was released in that window, news and government organizations struggled to expose the manipulation. And the victim of the deepfake ended up losing in a very close election. To position the IC to address generative AI-enabled foreign influence efforts, we have an IC group focused on multimedia authentication that leverages DARPA's semantic forensics technology among other tools, and enables those in the IC who are working on election security to rapidly access media forensic experts to facilitate the authentication of foreign suspect media related to the U.S. election. Members of this group regularly engage technical experts inside and outside of the government to ensure we are applying the latest techniques. And if state and local officials have concerns, for example, about media that is suspected to be synthetic or manipulated and violates a law or is tied to a foreign actor, they can request authentication assistance through the FBI. And of course, the most significant foreign actors who engage in foreign influence activity directed at the United States in relation to our elections are Russia, are the People's Republic of China, or PRC, and Iran. Specifically, Russia remains the most active foreign threat to our elections. The Russian government's goals in such influence operations tend to include eroding trust in U.S. democratic institutions, exacerbating socio-political divisions in the United States, and degrading Western support to Ukraine. Russia relies on a vast multimedia influence apparatus, which consists of its intelligence services, cyber actors, state media, proxies, and social media trolls. Moscow most likely views such operations as a means to tear down the United States as its perceived primary adversary, enabling Russia to promote itself as a great power, whereas Beijing seeks to promote support for China's policy positions and perspectives, including in the context of specific elections, portray the U.S. democratic model as chaotic, ineffective, unrepresentative, and magnify U.S. societal divisions. And the PRC also has a sophisticated influence apparatus through which they leverage emerging technologies, including generative AI, and they are growing increasingly confident in their ability to influence elections globally, but remain concerned about the possible blowback in the event their efforts are disclosed. In fact, in 2020, we assessed that China did not deploy influence efforts intended to change the outcome of the U.S. presidential election, principally because of concerns regarding blowback if caught. And thus far, we have no information to suggest that the PRC will take a more active role in this presidential election than it did in 2020, even as they continue to engage in efforts to promote politicians at all levels who are taking positions favorable to China on key issues. Needless to say, we will continue to monitor their activities. Finally, Iran is becoming increasingly aggressive in their efforts, seeking to stoke discord and undermine confidence in our democratic institutions, as we've seen them do in prior election cycles. They continue to adapt their cyber and influence activities using social media platforms, issuing threats, disseminating disinformation, and it is likely that they will continue to rely on their intelligence services in these efforts and Iran-based online influencers to promote their narratives. We've also observed other countries attempt to support or undermine specific candidates, but these efforts tend to be on a smaller scale. For instance, some other countries do things like direct campaign contributions to candidates they believe would promote their interest if elected and seek to obscure their support. In brief, the election threat landscape is increasingly challenging, but our capacity to manage the threat has also improved, as you will hear from colleagues. There is nothing more important or fundamental to our democracy than protecting our elections, and I can tell you that we are focused and ready to do our part, and I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Chairman, Vice Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss CISA's efforts to protect and defend our nation's election infrastructure. Since 2017, when election infrastructure was designated as critical and CISA was designated as the sector risk management agency, CISA and our partners, including the intelligence community and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, have made significant progress increasing the security and resilience of the nation's election infrastructure, working to support state and local election officials who serve on the front lines of our democracy, administering, managing, and securing our elections. Election infrastructure has never been more secure, and the election stakeholder community has never been stronger. As a result, these election officials ran secure elections in 2018 and 2020 and in 2022. As you know, there is no evidence that malicious actors changed, deleted, or altered votes or had any material impact on the outcome of any of these elections. This, of course, has been validated time and again, including in multiple court challenges, and in any race that was close in 2020, there were paper records that could be counted and recounted and audited to ensure accuracy. In this job, I've had the privilege to spend time with chief election officials across the nation, of both parties, and I know how tirelessly they work to ensure that their citizens' votes are counted as cast. It's why I have confidence in the integrity of our elections and why the American people should as well. However, we cannot be complacent. While election infrastructure is more secure than ever, as you just heard, the threat environment is more complex than ever. We have seen, as the DNI noted, that foreign adversaries remain a persistent threat to our election infrastructure, aiming to undermine American confidence in election integrity and our democratic institutions, and to sow partisan discord. These are efforts which will be exacerbated by generative AI capabilities. Perhaps more concerning are the continued physical threats to election officials, which largely stem from unfounded claims that the results of the 2020 election did not represent the will of the American people. Such claims are corrosive to the sacred foundations of our democracy, and they have led to harassment and threats of violence against election officials of both parties and their families. As a result, we've seen a wave of resignations, with election officials taking operational experience and institutional knowledge with them, and some of those who remain are operating under difficult conditions. We at CISA are very proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with these election officials, these election heroes, who are on the front lines of our democracy. In fact, CISA is providing more services in more jurisdictions than ever before, with training and resources featured on our Protect 2024 website. Since the beginning of 2023, we've provided over 340 cybersecurity assessments, 520 physical security assessments, 70 tabletop exercises, 220 training sessions that reach 9,000 election stakeholders every week. We provide reports to nearly 1,000 election entities with highlighting vulnerabilities so they can be immediately remediated. We've provided and sponsored 230 security clearances for election officials and worked with the intelligence community to provide classified briefings on foreign adversary threats. And most recently, we hired 10 dedicated regional election security advisors who bring a combined 210 years of election expertise and experience to work on the front lines with election officials. Finally, we remain laser focused on the threat of foreign malign influence operations, providing guidance as recent as last month on the tactics of disinformation used by our foreign adversaries. We'll continue to use our Rumor versus Reality website to provide accurate information about election infrastructure security, and perhaps most importantly, we will amplify the voices of state and local election officials who are the true authoritative subject matter experts when it comes to elections. These election officials know that while elections are political, election security is not, and we at CISA are committed to keeping it that way and look for your leadership and support in helping us do so. Thank you.
And it's my understanding, Ms. Knapp, you're not going to do opening, right? Let me, first of all, thank the witnesses for their testimony and particularly acknowledge what Jen Easterly just said is, our election officials are our election heroes, and many of them who serve diligently opening and closing polls for decades on end. The fact that they are under a level of harassment at this point really is one of the most serious efforts, I think, to undermine our democracy. Some of that may be domestically generated, but some of that could also be enhanced by foreign interest. Let me direct my first question to Director Haines. Again, I think there has been some rewriting post-2016 that somehow some of the activities in Russia or even in 2020 with Iran, that there was kind of harmless trolling. Can you speak to the fact that literally the level of violence that was incited in cases or exacerbating racial strife, religious strife, these adversaries, these foreign adversaries, are trying to pit us against each other at unprecedented levels, literally leading to violence?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you did a very nice job in the opening of highlighting a number of such incidents. I will say that just starting with Iran, it is, as I noted in the opening statement, increasingly aggressive in their efforts, seeking to stoke this kind of discord and promote chaos and undermine confidence in the integrity of the process. And they use social media platforms really to issue threats, to disseminate disinformation. And we saw how they did that in 2020. That's one of the incidents that you identified where they attempted to incite violence and threaten voters by sending spoofed emails designed to intimidate the voters, to incite social unrest, and distributing content basically including a video that implied that individuals could cast fraudulent ballots even from overseas, all entirely false, called out by my predecessor, Director Ratcliffe at the time, in 2020, and others in the intelligence community and law enforcement community. So I think that is a very good example. We've also seen Russia engage in these types of tactics, particularly in their global efforts to influence elections, trying to effectively incite disorder in order to distract sometimes law enforcement from being able to manage an election or do other things in that respect as well. I'll leave it at that.
And I would just say, I recall that incident, and again, it was a little bit of what Senator Rubio's question about, who announces. And there was a real show of force at that moment when we had the ODNI, we had the FBI director, we had the head of CISA. I believe, I'm not sure whether General Nakasone should, but it was, because our fear is who makes that message in a politicized environment. It needs to be people who are going to be viewed as much as possible credibly by both sides. And I think, again, in that case, the Trump administration did the right thing. Lots and lots of talk about AI. There's not a week that goes by that we don't see a new enhancement in terms of either video or audio deepfake capabilities. I don't think, even though we passed some bipartisan legislation out of the Rules Committee today that will get to national legislation on deepfakes. I would point out there's about a dozen plus states that have taken this on their own, and they range from red states to blue states and everything in between. So, and those of us who've been pushing the tech companies to do more, there were 20 tech companies that came together in what was called the Munich Accord, and this includes all of the big, it's the Facebooks, it's the Googles, it is also Twitter, TikTok, Anthropic, OpenAI, promising that they would have a commonality of watermarking so you can indicate if something has been altered. This is AI in elections. A commitment to try to take that content down and to educate voters. This was not just geared at America. Half the world is going to elections this year. Right now, India's got an election. The Europeans will have their parliamentary election shortly in June. I worry, that after that much publicized announcement in February, to use the old political term, where's the beef? I don't see that common watermarking standard emerging. I don't see these 20 tech companies moving in the aggressive nature that I would hope. I'd like to hear briefly from each of the witnesses on how you think the state of the collaboration between tech companies on making sure AI is not misused.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Chairman. I saw the letter that you sent out to those companies yesterday, which I think will be very helpful in getting specific answers. I will say we've been working with the generative AI companies specifically about threats to elections and ensuring that they are putting procedures and technology in place. Many of them are part of what's called CCPA, the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authentication. In addition, one of the very useful things that they're doing is if there are any questions about elections, they're actually driving people who use that technology to sources like canivote.org or Trusted Info 2024, which is the National Association of Secretary of State. Information that provides verified information at the state and local level. So it's really a validation that they are pushing people to those trusted sources. All that said, what we are doing are providing guidance to state and local election officials on AI threats and ways that they can mitigate such threats to their election infrastructure. We put out something in January and again in April about foreign malign influence.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that by saying that absolutely support everything that Jen just indicated. In addition, I think we're seeing both the opportunity for them to continue to provide detection tools, building relationships with some of the state and local partners, and that's been a part of what I think is important to continue to encourage. I think we're still in the process of watching them build out essentially their capacity and efforts in this area, and so things like your statement I think are helpful to sort of channel that energy and to begin to push forward on it. I think another thing that we're obviously doing is we've been engaging with them in order to make sure that we understand the technologies they're bringing to bear to make sure that we're producing basically the state-of-the-art identification authentication services within the IC and also for state and local partners if they so request appropriately, as I indicated, through the FBI. And we're also promoting the adoption of DARPA's suite of technologies, frankly, in this area that really allows users to detect, to characterize falsified media assets, to defend in particular against large-scale automated disinformation attacks to public authorities and to third parties. So I think all of that is sort of mutually reinforcing in this area.
Ms. Knapp?
Thank you, sir, for the opportunity to respond. Obviously, AI is definitely a concern to us as well. Whenever we get any sort of intelligence, we do provide it to the social media companies for action. Sorry, can you hear me now? When we do get any sort of intel indicating the hand of a foreign adversary, that information is provided to social media companies, whether it is as simple as an internet protocol address, an email address, or a phone number for them to take what action deemed necessary.
Right, and I understand the talk about protecting the infrastructure. It's very important, but I want to focus on it. And I'm going to largely base the scenario I'm about to outline. I'm going to base it on a CNN February 9th exclusive about a tabletop exercise, and it basically describes the following tabletop exercise. China creates a fake AI video showing a Senate candidate destroying ballots, and they're able to identify but that it's AI, that it's fake. So we have the ability to do that, and I think that's what you've described the DNI's office is able to do through that, through DARPA, I guess, the effort, the semantic forensics technology and all that. Okay, so we know it's fake. What the article says, and what I want to know, maybe the article's wrong and you could correct me, is after that, in this tabletop exercise, no one knew what happened next. There was, they struggled on what the response should be. There was a struggle to who would notify the public. According to this article, no, and the number 2 at the FBI, number 2 at CIA, number 2 at DHS was part of this tabletop. Nobody raised their hand and says that we will do it. We want to be the ones in charge of notifying the public. There was real consternation if, in fact, this was being promoted through a cutout, like maybe I imagine like a blogger. Let's say there's a right-wing blogger or a left-wing blogger, and that person is the one that released the video. Now there was certain fear that if we go out and say that this video is fake and this person is spreading it, people are going to say the government itself is interfering in our elections. And then a real question about if so many Americans already don't trust the federal government or the intelligence agencies, you know, how can we get them to trust us that this is not a real video? So here's what I want to ask. If, in fact, a scenario like this plays out, video comes out, I'm not on the ballot this year, so let's use me. Video comes out, and it's me in an audio recording, fake, saying, yeah, I'm going to rig the election, and I'm going to steal a bunch of ballots. It's fake. You know it's fake. What happens at that point? Because I'm now a week before the election, 6 days before the election. Does someone notify me? Am I able to say that? Is someone going to come out and say, this is not real, he really didn't say that? What happens? Because this article says it would be turned over to state and local officials. I don't know what a state and local official is supposed to do. They're going to turn around and say, yes, the DNI's office or the FBI or somebody told us this was fake. I don't understand what the process that would happen at that point is. Do we have a process that would kick in a situation like that one that I just described?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I wasn't at the tabletop exercise, so I don't know what happened in that particular scenario, but I understand that's not actually an accurate representation of what the discussion was. I would say that in terms of what would happen, yes, there would be a statement. So I think the model that I pointed to in 2020 is an appropriate model if there is basically a video or some fake, some deep fake or disinformation that's being promoted. It could be that we find out about it through intelligence. It could be otherwise identified, and it would go through, if it's intelligence, through the notification framework. The notification framework is an interagency group that basically indicates, okay, we think this is something that deserves a
I
public
apologize. I
statement.
don't mean to interrupt you. But
Yeah,
I just wanted to ask you this for
please.
clarification. So the video is clearly fake.
Yeah.
You'll be able to, you may not be able to attribute it to a
Right,
foreign entity, but
exactly.
you'll at least be able to say, this is not real, and we're working to see where it came from. Maybe it was designed by some guy in a basement, but maybe it was designed by a nation state.
Yeah.
But at a minimum, we have to be able to say, this thing is not real,
Yeah.
and it could be the work of a foreign adversary. Who, I say we, but who would be, would you be the one that would stand up? Is it the DNI? Is it the FBI? Who would be the person that would stand before the American people and say, we're not interfering in the election, we just want you to know that video is not real? Who would be in charge of that?
Yeah, so I could be the person that goes out and makes that determination. And I'll just give you an example, frankly, one of the ones that the chairman just mentioned from this morning. There's an article today about the fact that there is a fake video that was basically promoted, we think, by Storm 1516. It's a Russian affiliated group, basically. And that video purports to show a whistleblower and a Ukrainian former employee of a made-up CIA-supported troll farm tasked with interfering in the upcoming presidential election. CIA immediately came out with a statement that basically indicates and is reflected in the article that this is fake. And I am here to say categorically that this claim is patently false, that there is no such thing. It is disinformation. And that is the kind of approach that we'll continue to take across the board.
Okay, but is that established that you would be, you say you could be the one that, I mean, who is, I guess my point is that really, I don't want there to be any gray area. Like someone needs to be in charge of interfacing with the American people and ultimately saying, we will be responsible for notifying the American people.
Yes,
Has
the
that been
only-
established?
The only hesitation that you hear from me is based on the fact that there may be certain circumstances in which, for example, a state or local official or other basically public authority is in a better position to make the public statement initially and for the rest of us to come back behind. So it's just a question going through the process and determining what exactly is the issue that's being raised, what's the fake information that's being put forward, who is going to be the best essentially official to immediately come out
And
and
who makes that
disclaim
decision
it.
about who the best
That's
person is?
through, for example, the notification framework.
I think it's a very valid question. And I'll remind colleagues, in open hearings, we go straight seniority. Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and it's good to have all three of you here. And I'd like to start by saying I've long believed that you have to follow the money to understand election interference in America. And today I want to start with influence buying because I think one very effective way for a foreign adversary to interfere in an election is to compromise a candidate. And the best way you do that is with money. Now, last year, Donald Trump argued to a court that the value of his assets could not be inflated because he could always find a Saudi buyer who would pay any price that he would suggest. The judge was just taken aback, and he wrote in his opinion that the statement of the former president suggested, quote, influence buying. So the question I'd like to ask you, Director Haines, is let's set aside Donald Trump, okay, for purposes of this question. Is a foreign country's influence buying of a candidate, in your view, a counterintelligence concern and a form of interference?
Absolutely. And it's a tactic that we've seen, for example, the Chinese engage in quite regularly.
Good. Then let's go to data purchases, something you and I have talked about, because one way for a foreign adversary to tailor their influence is through the purchase of large amounts of Americans' private data. The executive order that President Biden signed on February 28th and the data export bill included in the recent foreign military and supplemental, those were welcome steps, and I think you know I've indicated that. But unlike the bipartisan bill I have with Vice Chairman Rubio, they only apply to a handful of countries, which in my view means they just don't really get the job done. So the question here, Director Haines, is couldn't the countries covered by the executive order in the recently enacted data export legislation, like China and Russia, couldn't they just get the data from countries that aren't covered, either by taking advantage of weak privacy laws or setting up front companies?
I think it's sort of fact-specific, and it's hard for me to make a very broad generalization, but there's no question that both Russia and China, for example, look to obtain critical information, including, for example, polling data that ultimately allows them to determine the targets of their influence campaigns, including with respect to funding illicitly.
So would you work with the Vice Chairman, Senator Rubio, and I to clean up these loopholes and pass effective legislation? Because it just seems to me we can say there's progress, no question about that, but you're just going to have a lot of the people who are engaging in these corrupt activities just make their way to countries that aren't covered. Then they're going to look at weak privacy laws, they're going to look at front companies, and bam, we're off to the races again with more corruption of the election process. So I think we need to have the bill that the Vice Chair and I put in to really close that loophole, and I gather I ought to quit while I'm ahead because you said you'll work with us.
Absolutely. I'd work with you on really any legislation you have to offer, so
Very
please.
good.
Thank you.
So with respect to this election worker issue question for you, Ms. Knapp, we got a lot of interest in this strong statement that Director Wray put out. Wanted to make sure we protect election workers from threats of violence. This is something I hear from all of our county officials in my state. This is a obvious and ongoing threat to democracy. Tell us, if you would, Ms. Knapp, what you are involved with in this area about the harassment of election workers, the general incitement of violence. What are your priorities in this area?
Thank you for that question, sir. Obviously, as you had said, election workers are critical to our democratic process, and they are the front line of democracy. In terms of what we're seeing in this space is obviously election workers are being harassed via robocalls, via white powder letters, as well as swatting. And we take all of those incidents very seriously. We work very closely with the Department of Justice's Election Crimes Task Force. To date, since its inception in 2021, there have been 17 successful convictions, as well as 13 sentencing. We continuously work with state and local authorities on these matters to hold any and all individuals that have been identified accountable for those actions.
My time is up. I'm going to ask you a question for the record, Ms. Knapp, about this gentleman, Alexander Smirnov, and he was recently charged with lying to the Bureau, as you know, when he passed on disinformation about the Biden family. I'll ask you for the record. My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Risch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I understand. I apologize. We were in a Foreign Relations Committee meeting, but I apologize. I think Senator Rubio made reference to the letter which he and I sent to you, Director Haines, regarding the 51 former intelligence community people who signed the letter regarding Hunter Biden. Does that ring a bell with you at all?
Yes, sir. I don't remember every detail of it, but I certainly
I'm going to
remember
help you
the
out
letter.
here. I'm going to help you out here.
Good deal. Thank you, sir.
No, it isn't a good deal, but I'm going to help you out here. We asked 6 questions, and only one of those 6 questions was answered. So I'm going to ask you here publicly. And by the way, let me tell you how this fits in. I'm as concerned with this sort of thing as I am with foreign interference on the election process. And this was deplorable. These 51 people saying this was Russian activity when we all know now that it wasn't. I mean, these were 51 people that had very significant influence in American society, and they sent this letter saying that this was Russian influence. So let me ask some questions here. One of the questions we asked is how many of those 51 people currently hold security clearance? And that was as of May 31st of 2023. So let me ask it now. How many of those 51 people still hold a security clearance?
I believe we provided you with an answer on that. I don't
Not.
recall the, I thought we did. All right, if we did not, we will get that to you
Okay.
shortly. We have that information.
All right, so how many of the Appendix A individuals maintain business arrangements, contracts, or other consulting arrangements with any element of the U.S. intelligence community between October 1, 2020 and October 31st, October of 2020? That question was not answered.
Yes, sir. That question we're still trying to get an answer to.
You're still trying to get an answer to it?
Yes, sir.
That, this is security clearance as of October of 2020. Surely you got a list of these people, whether or not they had security clearance in October.
We have a list of the people that had security clearances. As I said, that's an answer that I thought we had provided. We will provide that to you. On the contracts, that's a much more complicated question, and that's something that we're looking to give you.
How many of the Appendix A individuals currently maintain business arrangements, contracts, or other consulting element of the U.S. intelligence community? And that was as of May 31st, 2023, and move that forward to today, both of those last two questions. How many of those people, of those 51, had the arrangements in October of 2020, and how many of them have any contacts today? Could you get that information for us?
I don't have that information now, but we will look to provide it to you.
Okay, so let's talk about this particular problem. Senator Rubio was asking the question about who's going to stand up and look in the camera and say, this is baloney. And that's going to be you, I think you've said. That's the high responsibility that you have. And that was in the context of foreign interference in an election. What about this sort of thing, where it's domestic interference that's obviously false? Who's got the responsibility for standing up and looking in the camera and saying, folks, don't count on this, it's not true? Is that going to be your responsibility?
Sir, I think, look, my responsibility with respect to farmers that speak out and provide the wealth of their experience and knowledge in such circumstances is not to determine what they should or shouldn't say, but rather to ensure that they're not disclosing classified information, that we're protecting that and dealing with that. It's not, yeah.
What if it's false and they're using their robes of their having knowledge of security matters and intelligence matters, and you know it's false? Is that your response, or do you just say, no, I'm not going to get involved in that?
I don't understand, because I think, first of all, I think they said that their experience makes them deeply suspicious of that activity, right? And I wouldn't.
They went a little farther than
Yeah.
that, I think, but I'll take your characterization of it.
Okay.
And if you know that's false and you come into the information that it's false, is it your obligation or not your obligation to stand up, look in the camera and say, folks, when you're voting, don't take this into account?
Sarah, I don't think I could even, frankly, make sure that I've read everything that a former might have said or that anybody else has on these issues. So no, I don't think that it's appropriate for me to be determining what is truth and what is false in such circumstances. And
But what if you know?
yeah,
I mean, you're sitting here, you're the center of intelligence in America, right there. And this has come out and you know it's false. What's your obligation, or do you have any?
I think my obligation is to ensure that the best intelligence is being provided to the president, to the federal government, to the Congress, and where possible to the American people through declassifications,
But not-
which we would do.
Not calling out someone who stands up and purports to have intelligence information that you know is false.
Sarah, if I were to, first of all, I'm not sure I'm the best arbiter of what is true and false. And secondly,
Let's say in a particular instance, you've seen the paper. You know it's false. Let's take that instance. What do you do?
I mean, it depends on the situation. If we're talking about a fake video
Situation
that's
is just
been
what I
put
said.
forward.
Somebody
right,
with
then-
intelligence
yeah.
credentials stands up and says, I know this from an intelligence standpoint, and you know, as the director of national intelligence, that it's false.
No,
What
I do not.
you do?
I do not consider that to be part of my responsibility. If there is
you're not-
disinformation that is put forward, false information, right, then we have the capacity to authenticate it or to identify it as false. We will do so basically to our customers, and there will be a process whereby determinations
But
are
not to
made.
the
And it may
public.
not be, it may be to the public, but it might be classified information. It might be anything else. I don't know.
My
Under the
time's up,
circumstances, it's
and
too
I'm
much of
not
a
making
hypothetical.
progress, so I'm going to give it back to you.
Well, I just, again, we ought to continue to pursue this. I mean,